Welcome to General Admission Monthly, a podcast playing some tunes, talking about those songs, and making you more aware of music that you might have missed. I'm John Krutoff, a loudmouth, and I think that's probably my only qualification. So yeah, this episode deals with the Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, California punk band, The Dicks. So, if you are a regular listener, thank you, first of all, for listening regularly. I did miss last month's podcast and writing because, well, I was a bit under the weather. And by a bit under the weather, I mean I had pneumonia. So, I wasn't really feeling well. And it's taken about a month for it to sort of leave my system and also get me back to feeling some sort of normalcy. So I apologize for the delay. For the couple of you who reached out and said, "Hey, where's the podcast? I'm looking forward to it this month." I thank you again, and hopefully this one lives up to your expectations. I played before my little administrivia there. I played Dicks Hate the Police off their first 7-inch from 1980, and that's clearly the best song by the band, and I needed to get it out of the way right off the top. Because really, it's not just the Dicks' best song. It's probably among the top 10 punk bands songs ever. It's a great song, top to bottom. So, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the two bands. Because there are, in fact, two Dicks. There's actually a lot of Dicks out there, but the Dicks were the first Dicks were formed in Austin, Texas in 1980, first as a poster band, which if you didn't live through the 80s and 90s, you probably don't know what a poster band is, because on the internet, every band is kind of like a poster band. It's basically a band that only existed in posters. Now, that's kind of a weird statement to make when, in hindsight, of course, the Dicks existed as a real band. So, what the hell's going on here? Well, Gary was, as many of the early punks, a little artistic, a little fun, looking to outrage, and so a poster band was kind of a thing. So he wanted to be in a band, put up a band as if he was in it, called the Dicks, and people started getting interested into this band. Hey, when can I hear the Dicks? The band didn't exist until basically a chance meeting at the local dive bar, which happened to be Raoul's. And if you're familiar with Austin punk history, Raoul's is kind of a key point in early Austin punk. Gary met Buff and Glenn, two people who had recently relocated from San Antonio, but of course were now living in Austin, or then living in Austin, I should say. And Buff was was a bass player. Glenn Taylor, a guitar player. So the last thing the band needed was a drummer. And that drummer would end up being Pat Deason. And they play their first show at the Punk Prom at Armadillo World Headquarters in Austin, Texas, May 16th, 1980. That show actually was recorded and has been released a couple of times, once as a bootleg, once as part of the Hungry Butt CD, and I think also as part of a live 10-inch that came out on Delta Pop in the mid-2000s. So that sort of set of songs has circulated widely, and we'll play some of those in a little bit. The other thing about that show, and how is this for a hell of a first show? The headliner was Big Boys. Underneath them were The Next, Reactors, and Sharon Tate's Baby. All great bands. So that's kind of like how you start your band. That's pretty fucking good. Now, you may hear Austin and go, oh, that's that liberal town in Texas. And today it is. If you go to Austin today, its whole shtick is about keeping it weird and letting your freak flag fly. And it's kind of got a hippie vibe to it, a lot of it. And that sort of stuff drew me to the place in the mid-90s when I lived there. Well, mid to late 90s. But in 1980, Austin was still quite a conservative town. The frats were people that were not really liberal thinking. They were conservative, very straight-laced, very run-of-the-mill, let's say. Everyone from the Big Boys, the Dicks, MDC, who were called the Stains at the time, and Scratch Acid, Butthole Surfers, all those bands had sort of the same sort of origin story. They knew something was going to burst, but they didn't know what it was or when it was, and they were just kind of exploring that sort of tension. Gary, Buff, Pat, and Glenn were just one set of those groups of people waiting for things to burst. Now, it wouldn't be a real historical retelling if I didn't touch on, before the Dicks, Big Boys, Scratch Acid, Butthole Surfers, those early 80s punk bands, there was a group of bands that preceded them. And all the bands from the late 70s were bands like the Huns, Standing Waves, the Skunks, the Violators, and Terminal Mind. So the second wave of punk hatched not entirely out of nowhere. There was, let's say, some fertilizer that helped them sprout. Now, some of those bands were much more new wavy and certainly trying to cash in on those sorts of new wave elements that were happening in Austin at the time. As I said before, the first show has been bootlegged and circulated for a while in legit and illegitimate releases. So let's have a listen to some of those early versions of the songs from bootleg that's circulated, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more.
You're laughing at me and you look funny as hell.
Are you stupid? Or just a bastard? My body's aching. I need a rest. My body's aching. Take out a rest. Your wheelchair's broken. You got the flu. Don't quit me smoking. Your time's all through. My body's aching. I need a rest. My body's aching. Take out a rest.
They got a little waitress over here wants you to meet. Half you cocks are that pretty, I'll be hetero. Pretty, huh? You like it? You know? Spend a lot of time at the bookstore. Well, that's okay too.
We suck good, you fucking ass, bitch.
Oh. Disco time. It's disco time for you little boys out there. Set me free, why don't you, baby? Get out of my life, why don't you, baby? You really don't love me, just keep me hanging on. You said when we broke up, you still wanna be friends. But how can we be friends when seeing you only breaks my heart again? And there ain't nothing I can do about it, baby. Set me free, why don't you, baby? Get out of my life, why don't you, baby? You really don't love me, you keep me hanging on. You said when we broke up, you still wanna be my friend. But how can we be friends when seeing you only breaks my heart again? And there ain't nothing I can do about it, baby. Get out of my life. Set me free. Get out of my life. Set me free. Why don't you, baby? Get out of my life. Why don't you, baby? You keep me hanging on. You said when we broke up, you wanna be friends. But how can we be friends? It only breaks my heart again. And there's nothing I can do about it. Not a fucking thing I can do about it. Even my fucking tits are hard, baby. There's nothing I can do about it. Set me free. Set me free. Set me free. Free. Set me free. Set me free so I can love again. You wanna fall in love with me? You wanna fall in love with me? You like me? Ha! What a day! Isn't that pretty? More disco.
So even early on, you can hear some of the influences of the surrounding area on the Dicks. While you may not realize it, one of the best blues clubs in America was Antone's, and you guessed it, Austin, Texas is the home of Antone's. Starting in the early 70s, Antone's brought a lot of the big blues artists through, and is widely cited as being sort of the root of where Austin becomes the city of music. The blues influence you can hear definitely on Shit Fool and some of the early Dick songs. Even the vocals of Hate the Police have a blues kind of element. Gary's singing, he's not screaming, he's not like Black Flag, it's more rootsy, bluesy kind of thing going on. Furthering the idea, some of the post-Dicks work by Buff have certainly been mining the roots blues genre for material, so there's definitely something to this idea. Gary and Buff have both said in multiple interviews that they were listening to all sorts of music prior to getting together in the Dicks. So, again, probably some blues, probably some other roots sort of based music influence there. There's another thing going on in the early Dicks music that I think is tangentially related to the Austin-specific Cosmic Cowboy thing that was going on at the same time that the Dicks were sort of hatching. If you listen to Michael Murphy's Cosmic Cowboy and then the Dicks Hate the Police, you'll hear some similarities in the first 15 seconds or so. Albeit the Dicks were much rougher, but whereas Cosmic Cowboy was really produced and slick. But the way the guitars are structured in Dicks Hate the Police, with this sort of drone, is echoed by what was playing at the time in Austin in those, in Michael Murphy's band anyways. So I wonder if maybe Glenn, who wrote the guitar line for Hate the Police, picked up on that and just sort of tweaked it a little. In those early days, the Dicks and Big Boys were, as said before, thick as thieves. It could have been that several of the members of both bands were a little older than 18-year-old punks. Gary was old enough to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, so was Biscuit. Gary registered as a conscientious objector, by the way. Biscuit met Gary early on in Austin, and they both were waiting for something to happen. Gary had come back from San Francisco in the late 70s after seeing Sex Pistols play their first show, and punk was what was happening. That friendship existed between the two bands for, well, probably for decades. Even it surpassed past both bands ceasing to operate as those bands. The other thing that people talk about with this band, the Dicks and the Big Boys, was that they are often described as a yin and yang to each other. Big Boys encouraging everyone to have a party, the Dicks being confrontational. Big Boys were politically conscious, but careful to not beat you over the head with it. The Dicks were in your face about it. Big Boys were a soft caress to the face, making you feel loved. The Dicks were a punch to make you feel alive. The bands played together at least 23 times between 1980 and 1984, and that's just from the flyers that both bands appeared on. Quickly after a few shows, though, the band, the Dicks, I should say, got into Earth and Sky Studio and recorded Hate the Police. Almost immediately it became a rarity, as more than half the pressing was left on the back of a truck and lost to the heat and streets of Texas. It's appeared on Want List almost immediately, and after probably 2 decades of chasing this thing, it's still my white whale. I've never seen a copy in real life in person. One day. Speaking to that, here's Lifetime Problems. One thing to mention that you should know, Dicks Hate the Police has been reissued by the San Francisco label 1234 Go, which is also a record store in San Francisco. Good one. If you're in the Bay Area, check it out. 2 locations in Oakland and in San Francisco proper, with the surviving members of the Dicks getting a cut of the reissue. So that's a real key point. Because the record was sold in 1980 and probably 250 of them exist, all the subsequent bootlegs over the last, well, probably 2 decades, the band hasn't seen a cent from. So if you're going to try and pick up this record, certainly go to the 1234 Go version. There's lots of colors out there, so if you want to get record collector nerdy about it, they have, I think, for each pressing a different color, and I think each color is of 500, and then there's some rarer ones that, you know, if you go on Discogs, you'll find out about. And it seems like the bootlegger keeps on with it, and it's a vastly inferior version of the record. It actually doesn't sound better than the 1234 Go version. So whatever you do, just buy that one, eh? Concurrently, or maybe even before Hate the Police was recorded, 2 sets over 2 nights at Raoul's were also recorded. Now, the recording happened in September of 1980, so both bands playing on both nights, and then a cohesive record pasted together. The other band, of course, being Big Boys. An interesting note, the person who recorded Hate the Police, Dan Dryden, also recorded the live sets of both bands. This one was rare enough, although I've seen it several times in recent memory at a decent price. I've heard there were upwards of 5,000 of the split pressed, so it's out there for sure. If that's not good enough for you, in the mid-90s, Selfless Records reissued some of the record as a double 7-inch, so cutting off a couple songs, but adding one previously unreleased song to both the Dicks and the Big Boys recordings of that sessions, I guess they're sessions, live set. In the Dicks case, it was Kill from the Heart that was added to the 7-inch, and that's actually a pretty great live version of it. 1981 was spent mostly playing live and working on Kill from the Heart. A couple of notable things. Austin Music Awards. The Dicks were voted number 12 in Best New Wave Punk Band, the Big Boys taking second. The next year, 1982, New Wave was split from punk and hardcore, and in the punk and hardcore category, the Dicks would be third, with the Big Boys taking the top spot. Another thing, between 80 and 82, the Dicks were playing out in Austin, supporting touring bands like Black Flag, DOA, Minor Threat, as they all came through. Black Flag and Spot in particular was particularly impressed with the band and got them signed or agreed with Ginn to get them signed to SST to release the forthcoming Kill from the Heart. Again, the band went into Earth and Sky, but this time SST house producer Spot ran the dials. Now, Spot produced with a very specific sound, very neutral, very flat, and if the band is good, they can overcome it. I also think he's a better producer elsewhere than in his own California studio. The stuff coming out of his California studio, or the California studios that he worked at, were awful muddy. While Kill from the Heart also has that sort of muddiness or denseness on the record, it's a pretty good example of the Dicks at their peak, or at least the Texas Dicks at their peak. In advance of the record release in 1983, the Dicks did move to San Francisco prior to heading out on a 3-month U.S. tour organized by the Yippies called Rock Against Reagan. An unmitigated disaster of a tour. The tour did yield a couple of things. It didn't stop Reagan from getting in 1984, but it did sort of grow a kinship between the Crucifix and the Dicks, both bands who were known to sort of push the envelope of good taste. Other bands on the shows included the Dead Kennedys, MDC, Crucifix, so there was kind of a wide variety of punk on this Rock Against Reagan. Kill from the Heart was SST 17, released towards the end of the Dicks' run on the Rock Against Reagan tour, and that was about July of 1983. This is also the first SST record from a non-California band. It was also particularly delayed. A packaging error from the pressing plant, inserting the wrong vinyl into the sleeves, delayed it significantly, and the band kind of suffered from that. it's maybe a good time to talk about the art on Kill from the Heart, because it's pretty iconic as well. And I'm sure you've seen it. It's a Sacred Heart with a pair of assault rifles crossed behind it, and a sneakily but fairly prominently in the flame of the Sacred Heart is a hammer and sickle. So the artist of that is Carlos Lowry. And Carlos actually did all of the Dick's art. So if you look at the first 7-inch, the piece cover, which is fairly straightforward, and Kill from the Heart and These People, they're all done by Carlos Lowry. I'm going to play a couple of songs. First one, Dick's Pigs Run Wild off Kill from the Heart, off the original. And then Rich Daddy, again, off Kill from the Heart, but the remastered version.
They're the pigs with the guns. They watch us steal, they watch us run. 'Cause they can kill us and they'll be free in a couple of days. When the niggas kill us fast, we're not to shoot, so what man's that? 'Cause they can kill us and they'll be free in a couple of days. You know, man, it's an old fucking story. That'll make it right. Fucking I can't stand it. A war is near, that's no lie. But I'll be here when a red flag flies. The revolution is in the air. The pigs are wild, they're running scared. 'Cause they could kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. Man, it's an old fucking story. Oh, we're the niggers with the guns. We shoot the pig as he runs. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be back in a couple of days. 'Cause they can kill us, and we'll be ba
Alternative Tentacles, well, actually George Horn, remastered Kill from the Heart, adding some more dynamic range. It's interesting too because I think there's a slight speed adjustment as well that makes some of the newer songs, not newer songs, some of the songs seem slower on the remastered version. I wonder if that's maybe the original being pressed at 33 1/3 and the new one being pressed at 33, which is a strange modern thing that records are done at now. Either way, it's not a bad thing, just something I noticed. The Dicks, after the Rock Against Reagan tour, returned to Austin at the end of the tour to recharge and visit, and then went back to San Francisco. Apparently, and I'm not clear on this, and if somebody out there knows for sure, let me know, that the band moved to San Francisco and then moved back to Austin, leaving Gary in San Francisco. The band had essentially split up. Well, sort of. Buff and Glenn continued to play together. Gary formed a new band. Seeing as Gary wanted to continue playing songs he had put his sort of vocal signature on, and the rest of the original Dicks moving back to Austin, he recruited Lynn Perko, later of Imperial Teen, Sebastian Fuchs, and Tim Carroll to start playing some new songs, and some Dicks covers. This version of the band was billed as the Dicks. This version of the band played in the same style as the original band, sort of slashing guitar leads with a nod to some psychedelic sounds. But perhaps if psychedelic was an influence on the Dicks, the psychedelic influence would have come from the 13th floor elevators for the Austin Dicks, whereas the San Francisco one might have been more Pet Sounds, Beach Boys. And I think you understand maybe the difference with that. Texas was rougher, California was a little more polished. And that extended to the Dicks as well. Here's a couple songs from late in '83 from a bootleg from the Cathay de Grande show that the Dicks played.
Ladies and gentlemen, from straight from a very successful show at the Satanic Tabernacle of Wickenburg, I'd really love to introduce to you the incredible, unbelievable, the fucking Dicks, dude.
Song about the invasion of Grenada. So nobody asked me. I find myself talking more in audiences that I know people. Jimmy, Johnny, Paul, and Mara. I wish I knew Sebastian knows it. Says to see.
That was a few songs from a 1983 performance at the Cathay de Grande, which would have been fairly early recording of the new Dicks. Fake Bands is obviously a redo of the earlier version, and it's a pretty spot-on cover. Nobody Asked Me and Marilyn Buck were new compositions and appeared on the records that the new band would put out in 1984 and 85. Speaking of records, the first thing this version of the Dicks put out was the Peace 7-inch on R Radical, which is run by MDC, and that came out in 1984. I think I Hope You Get Drafted was the actual first song by the Dicks I owned, if I think about it, because I owned the Peace Comp and this was on it. And I owned the Peace Comp before I heard the These People LP. I didn't actually hear Kill From the Heart or even the amazing Hate the Police 7-inch until much, much later. Anyways, I Hope You Get Drafted is an amazing tune, so let's hear it.
You don't care about a nuclear war. How many people die? You're always laughing in the face of death. I look you straight in the eye and say, I hope you get drafted. I hope you burn and die. You a political asshole. Hope you're the first to cry. Your privileged life shows instead when you speak. Your education is lies. You're always laughing in the face of death. A child with fear in his eyes. You know, I hope you get drafted. I hope you carry a gun. When you come back it's with no arms or legs, then you can say war is fun. Cause you don't care what happens to me, as long as it don't happen to you. As the world becomes a bomb factory, your attitude becomes smug, and it creates an atmosphere of war, a war without any love. You know, I hope you get drafted. I hope you burn and die. You a political asshole. Hope you're the first to cry. Cause you don't care what happens to me, as long as it don't happen to you.
I think I Hope You Get Drafted is the perfect merger of Gary's urge to shock and offend. Remember, Hate the Police lyrics were written with Glenn, so it's not a Gary solo sort of writing. And the blues-influenced yowl that makes the song. There's also a bit of a snarl there. And when Gary sings about, I hope you get drafted, I hope you burn and die, you apolitical asshole, I hope you're the first to fry, those lines are sort of burned into my cerebral cortex or wherever in your brain that things get burned into. It's just like there. A perfect mergery of a delivery method that runs contrary to sort of the items being delivered. Because I think in any other context, somebody singing that would be, I don't know, it would seem confusing, I think. Anyways, 1984 saw the Dicks hit the road in their new configuration. ostensibly to road test some of the new material. Here's a couple of things from a St. Louis bootleg from '84.
It's weird to think that so many people take some kind of pride, some kind of weird pride in being apolitical. It's like the cops aren't apolitical, and Reagan's not apolitical, and most of the people that oppress us in our day-to-day lives are anything but apolitical. And it amazes me when punks come out to me and go, fuck you for being political. I just started going, well, I have nothing to do with the LCP. I have nothing to do with any political groups. Why should we align ourselves with political groups? It's just like everyday life should tell us something. It's like, this is talking about very, very poor people that we see every day that are on the street begging for money. It's sort of taking their point of view on a sidewalk beggar. important. Very important. So fucking important. The only last time you'll ever hear us say, it's called, you know, baby, you better think twice. How about I get this to the level, man? I have to do this sometimes. It just makes everything seem a little better. There's nothing metaphysical or religious about it. You better think twice. You better think twice. You better think when you're on the phone, you're rolling away. You know this wrong and everything you're saying. You know this right, that's what you're breaking my heart. You better think when you're on the phone, you better think twice. We got to break my heart. Break my heart. Break my heart. We got to break my heart. Break my heart and running through the day. You know this wrong and I'm rolling away. You better think when you're on the phone, you're breaking my heart. You better think right, that's what you better think right. We got to break my heart. Break my heart. Break my heart. You never let us try. I wanna know you, but now you wanna go and break my heart. You know I'm not really the morning, but now you want to put your first time. You better think twice. You better think quiet. You better be real before you roll it away. You know this wrong and everything to say. You better think quiet before you break my heart. You know this wrong and now you're breaking my heart. We gonna break my heart. Break it out now. Break it out now. Break it out now. Break it out now. Thank you.
So in that set, I played Dick's Sidewalk Begging and You Better Think Twice, which were played live in a St. Louis bootleg that I acquired over Soulseek. So if you are on Soulseek, you might be able to find them. I don't know much about that St. Louis gig other than it sounds like it was pretty raucous. So check it out. The second Dicks also were quickly snapped up by a record label, this time by Alternative Tentacles, and released These People in 1985. A second US tour with some of the footage making it to YouTube. If you look up Having Fun with Dicks and Jane, that's out there. There's also a couple of, I think there's a bootleg from, or a live video of them on Flipside. So there's at least 2 or 3 sets out there of live Dicks on YouTube. So happy hunting. 1984 and 85 were the years that the first huge wave of hardcore bands started breaking up, and the Dicks were no different. Some of it was the crowds wanting the bands to play faster and harder, and some of it were bands wanting to do something entirely different. Here's a couple songs off of These People. I'm going to start with The Police Force, which is the opener, and I think is a sort of lovely bookend to Hate the Police. And the last song I'll play is Dick's George Jackson, which is, I think, foretelling what would come next for Gary and Lynn Perko anyways.
Come back no more. Take you away, you don't come back no more policemen taking your ass to jail. Policemen, you tried to set your bail, trying to set your bail. Police force, what in the present lot? Police force, don't tell me that's all we've got. Don't you tell me those things are all we've got.
In that set, as I said at the top, I played Dick's The Police Force and Dick's George Jackson off of These People, which is on Alternative Tentacles. And that was the end of the Dicks. Well, kind of. until the mid-90s. There was a show in Austin during South by Southwest that had the band get up and play a small set. There was a couple of other sort of impromptu things. There was a benefit for Biscuit. There was a couple of other benefits that the Dicks sort of had impromptu shows in Austin to sort of thank people for their support over the years. In the mid-2000s, Delta Pop reissued Hate the Police outtakes as Hog and a live 10-inch, which is that first set that they played and was recorded from 1980. That brought a week-long tour on the East Coast. Unfortunately, Glenn had died probably 5 to 6 years before that and couldn't be a part of the reunions. Periodically, the Dicks would play again, off and on, until 2 years ago, 2016, when Halloween 2016, the band played their official final show. Does that mean the Dicks are over? Probably not. As whenever you have friends who have been friends for a long time in a band that people want to see, I wouldn't be surprised to see them play again. But it would probably be much like those mid-90s sort of shows where they all happen to be in Austin and just get up on stage and crank out a couple of tunes. For this month, I'm John Krutoff, and this podcast has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit General Admission blog on Medium at medium.com/general-admission. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's GenADM Show, so GenADM Show. If you're old and email, you can email me at generaladmissionshow@gmail.com. If you didn't like this podcast, in the words of the amazing Big Boys, go make your own podcast.
The last thing, I don't want to do that. The last thing I want to do is be schmaltzy, but it's a great love that we have with this band here. And sometimes people meet and I'm nice and they think, I thought you were a wild fucking bag banshee sucking cock under the freeway or something. It's like, I'm a fucking Buddhist now. But I still have a little bit of red in my heart, you know what I mean? So we'll see you again on the other side of heaven. This is the last song. We hope that you sing along with us. It's called Get Shaken Police.